Judge Harrison sat at the bench, his face a mask of impartiality. The courtroom was quiet except for the rhythmic tapping of his gavel. He was used to routine cases, small fines, minor infractions, a revolving door of people who had made mistakes but weren't criminals. It was an easy day, or so he thought. Cassandra Williams stood in front of him, her posture calm, her expression unwavering. She was dressed in a simple yet elegant suit, practical but with a quiet confidence that caught the judge's attention. Her eyes, dark and intelligent, held his gaze without flinching, as if she had been here 100 times before. But it wasn't arrogance. It was something else, something he couldn't quite place. Her case was straightforward, at least on paper. A minor violation of financial reporting, a misfiled tax form. It wasn't a big deal by any stretch of the imagination. But the paperwork said otherwise. She had been summoned, as all defendants were, but there was something about her that made the judge hesitate. Was it the meticulous way she spoke, the careful choice of her words, or perhaps it was the stark contrast between her and the other people in the room, most of whom looked guilty before they even entered? Her lawyer spoke first, presenting the case. He made a compelling argument about the misunderstanding, how the issue was a clerical error, a mistake in the filing system. The lawyer even suggested that the fine be reduced or waived altogether, citing Cassandra's exemplary history and contributions to the community. But Judge Harrison was not swayed. He'd heard it all before. In his courtroom, the rules were clear, and no one, no matter their background, was above them. "I'm afraid the law is clear, Miss Williams," Judge Harrison said, his voice stern. "While your case may seem minor, you still broke the regulations. I'm imposing a fine of $5,000. You'll have 30 days to pay it." The words hung in the air like a sudden storm. Cassandra nodded, but there was no sign of panic or frustration on her face. She simply accepted the judgment, her expression unreadable. There was no shock, no protest. The judge almost expected her to argue, but she didn't. The gavel came down with a decisive thud, signaling the end of the case. As Cassandra turned to leave the courtroom, Judge Harrison couldn't help but wonder what he had missed. There was something about her, something more than what met the eye. But the day moved on, as they always did in courtrooms, and Judge Harrison pushed the thought aside. What he didn't know was that this seemingly inconsequential fine would become the first domino in a chain of events that would change everything, not just for him, but for the entire nation. As Judge Harrison settled into his office later that day, the case of Cassandra Williams continued to nag at the back of his mind. It wasn't the fine itself that troubled him. It was the sense that something was off, that he was missing a crucial piece of the puzzle. He'd seen plenty of defendants with hard luck stories or sob stories, but Cassandra was different. The calm assurance with which she accepted her fate, the quiet confidence in her demeanor, it all seemed out of place. He tried to shake it off. After all, his job wasn't to uncover hidden layers of people's lives. His role was simple: apply the law. But the more he thought about her, the more intrigued he became. Something told him that the woman who stood before him was not just another person caught in a bureaucratic tangle. Outside the courtroom, Cassandra's life was anything but ordinary. She wasn't just a woman in trouble with the law. She was, in fact, one of the most sought-after economic consultants in the country. At just 34, she had already transformed the way the federal government viewed economic policy. Her innovative strategies for reducing wealth inequality and increasing access to economic opportunities were being quietly adopted by agencies and lawmakers at the highest levels. Few people outside of Washington, D.C. had heard her name, but those who knew her work referred to her as a quiet genius, a visionary reshaping the financial landscape. Her rise had been unorthodox. Cassandra had grown up in a working-class neighborhood, the daughter of a single mother who worked 2 jobs to make ends meet. Despite the odds stacked against her, Cassandra had excelled in school, earning a scholarship to a prestigious university. She had always been fascinated by economics, but it wasn't just the numbers that caught her attention. It was the way the system worked, or, rather, the way it didn't. Her passion was not for the theory, but for finding solutions to the very real problems that plagued the economy, problems that affected people like her mother, who had never once felt the full benefits of the financial system. After graduation, Cassandra had entered the world of consulting, where she quickly made a name for herself. But instead of focusing on corporate clients, she chose to work with government agencies, advising them on how to redistribute wealth more equitably, how to design policies that would help people build their own futures. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was necessary. And over time, her recommendations began to find their way into policy drafts, then into laws, then into the framework of the nation's economic strategies. What Judge Harrison didn't know, and what no one outside of those inner circles fully understood, was that Cassandra's latest proposal had the potential to reshape federal economic policy in a way that would make her one of the most influential figures in the country, if not the world. And yet, here she was, standing in his courtroom, caught up in a seemingly trivial legal matter. The judge had no idea just how far-reaching his decision was about to become. As the days passed, the courtroom incident began to fade from Judge Harrison's immediate concerns. He had other cases to deal with, and life in the courthouse continued its relentless march. But there was something about Cassandra Williams that stayed with him, something nagging at the back of his mind. He had a habit of paying attention to details, those small, seemingly insignificant things that others might overlook. And despite himself, he kept coming back to her. Meanwhile, Cassandra's influence was quietly, but powerfully, growing. While Judge Harrison reviewed more cases, unaware of the larger picture unfolding, Cassandra's strategies had started to make waves in the corridors of power. Her ideas were not radical in the sense of revolution, but they were radical in their approach, thinking about economics from a human perspective, not just as a series of numbers on a spreadsheet. Her focus was on redistributing wealth to those who needed it most, not through charity, but by creating policies that would allow communities to thrive on their own terms. It wasn't about temporary relief. It was about long-term, sustainable change. The first major breakthrough had come when Cassandra's analysis of the national income distribution had caught the attention of several influential policymakers. Her report, which called for a revaluation of tax structures and subsidies, had been picked up by a think tank and eventually made its way to Congress. At first, it was just one voice in a chorus of economic theories, but her data spoke for itself. Over time, her strategies gained traction, especially in the wake of rising economic inequality across the country. Federal agencies, particularly the Department of Economic Development and the Treasury, had quietly begun adopting her models for targeted investments in marginalized communities. Cassandra had an uncanny ability to predict the ripple effects of policy changes, and soon her suggestions were being woven into the fabric of the national agenda. What the public didn't see, however, was how many of her ideas had already been implemented at the state and local levels. They were making a difference, but not loudly. They didn't make headlines. Though her work was behind the scenes, it was far-reaching. Cities were benefiting from reinvestment strategies designed to strengthen local economies. Rural communities were getting access to grants for infrastructure that would allow them to compete on a more level playing field. Even the government's approach to social welfare was evolving to focus on creating opportunities, not just providing aid. Cassandra had spent years laying the groundwork for these shifts, and the impact of her efforts was now beginning to be felt across the country. What Cassandra had not anticipated, however, was how much this change would eventually collide with the world she was still trying to build, a world of thoughtful, methodical change. Her work was reaching a tipping point. It wasn't long before the attention of high-level officials, and even political opponents, was drawn to the results. But for now, she was content to remain in the background, letting the work speak for itself. Judge Harrison, still unaware of the full scope of her influence, would soon come to learn just how intertwined his world was with hers. What began as a simple legal case was about to become a window into something much larger, a turning point that neither of them could have predicted. Months passed, and Judge Harrison's life continued in its usual rhythm. cases, rulings, the occasional public speaking engagement. But every so often, a fleeting thought about Cassandra Williams would cross his mind, accompanied by an inexplicable sense of curiosity. He had never encountered a person quite like her. It wasn't just her calmness in the courtroom or the quiet strength she exuded. It was something deeper, something that pulled at him. Then one late fall afternoon, fate intervened. Judge Harrison received an invitation to a prestigious economic reform conference, a gathering of policymakers, economists, and thought leaders discussing the future of the nation's financial landscape. His role was to deliver a keynote speech on the intersection of law and economic justice, a topic he was familiar with, but not exactly passionate about. Still, it was an honor to be asked. He accepted the invitation. The conference was being held in a grand, polished convention center in the heart of the city, and Judge Harrison felt somewhat out of place amidst the economists, activists, and finance professionals. As he walked into the bustling venue, the air was charged with anticipation. Ideas were being exchanged, deals were being made, and the future was being shaped. At least, that's what it felt like. And then he saw her. Cassandra Williams was standing near a panel of experts, engaging in an animated conversation with several prominent economists. She looked entirely at ease, her presence magnetic. She was no longer the quiet woman from the courtroom. Here, she was a force, confident, well-spoken, her ideas commanding the room. He couldn't help but stare. She was the last person he expected to see here. And yet, there she was, moving through the crowd as if she belonged to this world. At first, he hesitated, unsure of how to approach her. He had no reason to. He was just another judge, a small part of the legal machinery, while she was an architect of national change. But as the afternoon wore on, a feeling of inevitability seemed to pull him toward her. He made his way through the sea of people, each step more reluctant than the last, until he found himself standing in front of her. Cassandra turned to face him, a smile of recognition crossing her face. "Judge Harrison," she said, her voice warm but measured. "I didn't expect to see you here." For a moment, they stood in silence, the weight of their previous encounter hanging in the air between them. It was awkward, yet strangely comfortable. He cleared his throat, trying to shake off the unease that had settled in his chest. "I didn't expect to see you either," he said, his voice betraying an awkwardness he wasn't used to. "I had no idea you were involved in all of this." She chuckled lightly, her eyes glinting with a mix of amusement and something else, something more thoughtful. "I suppose I tend to keep my professional life separate from my personal one," she replied, her tone soft but firm. "But I imagine you've seen the changes happening in the economy. I've had a hand in some of it." Judge Harrison blinked, surprised by her directness. He'd been aware of some of the recent shifts in federal economic policy, but to hear her openly acknowledge her role in it left him momentarily speechless. "I've been following some of the changes," he said, though he hadn't fully grasped the magnitude of what was happening. "But I didn't realize you were the one behind them. Your work, it's impressive." Cassandra's smile deepened, but she was careful not to let it veer into smugness. "It's just a start," she said, "but it's a start that could change things for a lot of people." As they spoke, Judge Harrison began to realize just how little he truly understood. Cassandra wasn't just some quiet defendant he had sentenced to 5 months ago. She was reshaping the very systems he had spent his career upholding. It was a thought that made him uneasy, but also curious. For the first time, he began to wonder whether he had misjudged her, or whether he had missed something far more important. The days following the conference were a blur for Judge Harrison. He couldn't shake the image of Cassandra Williams from his mind, standing there with such ease, commanding the attention of everyone around her. She had been gracious and composed, but there was something about the way she spoke, the way she discussed the country's economic future, that left him feeling unsettled. Her calm demeanor wasn't just a defense mechanism. It was an assurance that she was in control of something much bigger than anyone realized. Judge Harrison had always considered himself a pragmatic man. The law, to him, was about clarity, order, and fairness. But the more he thought about Cassandra's work, the more he began to question his own understanding of what fairness really meant. Her ideas, while still relatively unknown to the public, were gaining influence in the halls of power. And now, after their chance encounter, he realized that her policies weren't just theoretical. They were becoming tangible. They were changing lives, influencing decisions, and slowly shifting the economic tide. For the first time, Harrison found himself unsure of the assumptions that had guided his career. He had spent years upholding the law, following its letter without ever questioning its broader impact. But what if the law, at least as it stood, wasn't in alignment with the kind of world Cassandra was trying to build? What if, by finding people like her, he was inadvertently holding back progress? He found himself digging into Cassandra's work in his spare time, reading through her reports, her proposals, even watching some of her public speeches. The more he learned, the more it became clear just how integral her ideas were to the economic strategies taking shape in Washington. Her work on wealth redistribution, on equitable investments, and on creating sustainable community development projects wasn't just a theoretical exercise. It was becoming the backbone of federal policy in real time. Her influence was silent but undeniable. But the more Harrison delved into her work, the more he became conflicted. He saw the ways her ideas challenged the status quo, and while he admired the depth of her vision, there were things he didn't fully understand. For example, how could such radical change happen without disrupting the system entirely? Could these new policies, while beneficial to many, truly create the balance Cassandra envisioned without unintended consequences? He began speaking to colleagues in the legal community, asking them about Cassandra's impact and the broader implications of her work. He learned that some were already looking to her models as the way forward, while others, especially those with more conservative views, saw them as dangerous experiments. The legal community's mixed reaction only fueled his desire to learn more. Judge Harrison's own perspective was beginning to shift. He found himself torn between his role as an enforcer of the law and his growing understanding of the need for systemic change. He started to wonder, was he, too, part of the system that needed to evolve? Had his previous ruling been just a small, inconsequential action, or had it been a moment that, in retrospect, represented something much larger, a failure to see the bigger picture? As his thoughts turned increasingly toward the future, one thing became clear. Cassandra Williams wasn't just reshaping the nation's economic policies. She was challenging the very way he understood the world. And it left him asking a question he hadn't ever considered before. Was it time for him to change too? By now, the seeds of doubt had firmly taken root in Judge Harrison's mind. He'd always prided himself on his ability to follow the law without bias, to ensure that justice was served in its most straightforward form. But as he continued to learn more about Cassandra Williams and the work she was doing, he couldn't escape the feeling that the law he'd spent his career upholding wasn't always in line with the justice she was fighting for. Her strategies for economic reform weren't just about theory. They were about the very real lives of people, the communities that had long been overlooked by the system he had helped preserve. The more Harrison researched her work, the more he realized that Cassandra was challenging the core assumptions of the legal and economic systems, pushing for policies that prioritized people over profits, opportunity over tradition. Then, a turning point came. A large-scale public debate on economic reform was scheduled in Washington, and to Harrison's surprise, Cassandra was invited to testify. The event was being billed as an open conversation on how the government could address the increasing economic disparity between the wealthiest and the poorest Americans. The panelists included economists, politicians, and legal experts, but Cassandra, now firmly entrenched in the conversation, was the most anticipated speaker. Her ideas had become more than just the latest academic proposals. They were the foundation of national policy shifts. Harrison was invited to the event as a panelist himself, though not on the same panel as Cassandra. His role was to speak on the legal implications of economic reform, specifically how courts and lawmakers should adapt to the changing landscape. But as he sat in the audience and listened to Cassandra's words, he began to realize just how much he had missed. Her testimony was poised, passionate, and full of nuance. She spoke about how economic policies, if designed correctly, could empower entire communities, how the right mix of investments in education, infrastructure, and social services could lift people out of poverty without simply providing temporary relief. She wasn't just talking about fixing the economy. She was talking about reshaping the foundation of what the economy was supposed to be. But it was her next words that struck Harrison most deeply. "Economic systems are not neutral," she said, her voice steady but powerful. "They don't simply exist on their own. They are shaped by the laws that govern them, by the policies that dictate who gets what. And if we want real change, we need to rethink the very structure of those systems so they can serve everyone, not just the privileged few." Her words reverberated in Harrison's mind, as though a veil had been lifted. For years, he had viewed the law as a force that simply applied rules to maintain order. But now, he saw it through a different lens, one where the law didn't just reflect justice, it actively shaped the world around it. Cassandra wasn't just talking about economic policy. She was talking about justice itself, about how the very frameworks he had worked within might be part of the problem. As the panel discussions continued, Harrison's thoughts were consumed by her vision. He could see the room divided. Some applauded her ideas, others scoffed at them, afraid of the disruption they might cause. But Harrison wasn't thinking about the fear of disruption anymore. He was thinking about how, for the first time, he was questioning the very system he had been a part of his entire life. Cassandra Williams was more than just a brilliant economist. She was a revolutionary, a quiet disruptor who had begun to reshape not only the economy, but the very definition of fairness. And now, her ideas were forcing him to ask some difficult questions about his own role in this broader conversation. Had his previous ruling, that small fine for a minor mistake, been a sign that he, too, was part of a system that needed to change? The more he thought about it, the more he realized he wasn't just observing this shift. He was in the midst of it. The day after the panel, Judge Harrison found himself in deep reflection. The economic reform debate had left him unsettled, and it wasn't just the ideas that had shaken him. It was the growing recognition that his role in the system could no longer be taken for granted. It wasn't just about enforcing the law anymore. It was about understanding how those laws were being used to shape lives, for better or worse. And now, in light of Cassandra's work, he was beginning to see that the very legal structures he had long upheld might need to evolve if true justice was to be served. It was around this time that another surprise came his way. The national conversation surrounding Cassandra Williams had reached a tipping point. Her strategies were no longer being considered as bold ideas. They were being adopted by policymakers, lawmakers, and economic planners at the highest levels. Even more surprising was that a few lawmakers were pushing for a more direct involvement from Cassandra herself, suggesting she could become an official advisor to the federal government, someone who could help reshape the nation's economic policy in a way that would truly benefit all Americans. At the same time, Harrison found his own professional life taking an unexpected turn. The fine he had imposed on Cassandra, once just a routine ruling in a sea of many, was being revisited in the media. A journalist who had picked up on the connection between Cassandra's rising prominence and the judge's earlier ruling wrote a piece that caused a stir. The article wasn't just about the fine. It was about the larger implications of a legal system that, despite its best intentions, was potentially stifling innovation and progress. The piece highlighted how a small mistake had been treated with such rigidity, while someone like Cassandra, who was clearly changing the nation's economic outlook, was being judged through the same legal lens as anyone else. The controversy made headlines, and soon it was a topic of national conversation. A growing number of voices were questioning whether the legal system, as it currently stood, was doing more harm than good when it came to fostering progress. Some viewed the article as an unfair criticism of Harrison, but others saw it as a much-needed critique of how legal decisions, even minor ones, could impact larger movements. Cassandra's supporters began to rally around the idea that perhaps her fine should be overturned, seeing it as a symbolic gesture of the old system making way for the new. Suddenly, Harrison was thrust into the spotlight in a way he had never imagined. He was asked to appear on several talk shows and interviews, where he had to defend his decision. His answer, at first, was simple and direct. He had applied the law as it was written. But the more he spoke, the more he realized the question wasn't really about the fine. It was about something larger, the role of the law in perpetuating or stifling change. The public, and even some colleagues, began to question whether Harrison could remain neutral in this evolving conversation about justice. His reputation as a staunch enforcer of the law was being tested. But as he heard Cassandra's name come up in every interview, as he listened to the debates about her work and his role in the larger conversation, something in him shifted. He began to feel the weight of the questions he had been asking himself. Could the law adapt to the world Cassandra envisioned? Was his judgment, made in that sterile courtroom, a part of the very system that needed to evolve? In the days that followed, Judge Harrison began to publicly reconsider his original ruling. He acknowledged the symbolic weight of Cassandra's work, understanding that it was much bigger than the minor infraction for which he had fined her. In a statement, he announced that the fine would be reduced, if not entirely revoked, as a gesture of support for the work she was doing to reshape the nation's future. The gesture was more than just about a fine. It was Harrison's recognition that the world was changing, and with it, his own understanding of justice. In doing so, he not only acknowledged Cassandra's influence, but also signaled that he too was ready to embrace change. The tables had turned, and the judge who had once held the gavel now found himself questioning the very system that had placed him in power. In the weeks that followed Judge Harrison's public statement about reducing Cassandra's fine, the ripple effects were felt far beyond the courtroom. The news made headlines, and the story became a symbol of the larger national conversation about economic reform, justice, and systemic change. Harrison, who had spent his career as a steadfast enforcer of the law, was now being viewed by many as someone who was willing to adapt, to acknowledge when the system itself needed rethinking. Cassandra Williams, on the other hand, had become a household name. Her influence in reshaping federal economic strategies had grown exponentially. The work she had started quietly, behind closed doors, was now at the forefront of national discourse. Legislators, economists, and activists rallied behind her ideas, not just because they saw her as a brilliant economist, but because they believed she was the embodiment of a new wave of change, a change that was long overdue. But as much as the country was focused on her rise, Cassandra herself was humble in the spotlight. She didn't seek out attention or accolades. She remained focused on her mission, creating a more equitable, just economic system. The reduction of her fine had been a moment of personal vindication, but it also served as a broader symbol of the need for flexibility within the legal and economic systems. The moment Harrison had acknowledged her work was a signal that even the most entrenched systems could evolve. For Judge Harrison, this entire experience was transformative. He began to realize that the law wasn't a static force, but one that needed to grow with society. The same principles that had guided him in his judicial career, fairness, justice, and equality, were not incompatible with the work Cassandra was doing. In fact, they aligned more closely than he had initially recognized. He started seeing the law as a tool that could either protect the status quo or help dismantle it in favor of something better. For him, it was no longer enough to simply apply the law without considering its broader implications. Cassandra and Harrison's paths crossed once more, not in a courtroom, but in a meeting where the future of economic reform was discussed. Harrison was no longer just the judge. He was a partner in the conversation, a voice advocating for legal frameworks that could support the kind of change Cassandra envisioned. He used his position to champion the creation of a more inclusive, forward-thinking legal environment, one that would foster the kind of transformation necessary for her policies to take root and flourish. As they sat together, discussing the future, Cassandra offered a simple yet profound thought. Change takes time. But the beauty of it is, it's always happening. Sometimes we're just too caught up in the present to see how far we've come. Judge Harrison looked at her, now understanding the depth of her words. He had been part of a system that, in many ways, had prevented progress. But by listening, learning, and ultimately embracing a new perspective, he had become part of something much bigger. Together, they were helping to shape a new legacy, one that recognized the interconnectedness of law, economics, and justice. And for Harrison, it was the beginning of his own personal evolution. In the end, the fine had been more than just a financial penalty. It had been the spark that ignited a journey of discovery, transformation, and ultimately, progress. The world had shifted, and so had Judge Harrison. And for the first time, he could see that the change Cassandra had started wasn't just an idea, it was a movement, and he was part of it.